Before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let's dive in. The first snowfall of the season blanketed the small, isolated village of Hollow's Reach in an eerie silence. The snow wasn't the soft, pristine kind. It was ash-gray, dirty, and unsettlingly cold, biting at the skin even through thick layers of wool. Lena Carter tugged her scarf tighter as she walked the narrow path leading home, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. The locals had always whispered about Hollow's Reach being cursed. Stories of people vanishing in the winter storms had circulated for years, but Lena had dismissed them as old wives' tales meant to scare children. Tonight, the air felt wrong, heavier, quieter than usual. She quickened her pace as the wind began to howl, a mournful wail that seemed to carry whispers. The voices were faint but distinct, threading through the icy air. "Lena!" She froze. Her breath puffed out in white clouds, and she glanced around. The narrow path was surrounded by skeletal trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. She was alone, or so she thought. The voice came again, this time clearer, closer. It was her mother's voice, soft and trembling. "Lena, help me." Her mother had died 5 years ago. Her heart pounded and her legs trembled. Logic screamed at her to keep walking, to ignore the tricks of the wind. But her mother's voice called out again, this time mingled with the sound of labored breathing. "Help me! Please!" Tears welled in Lena's eyes. "Mom!" she called out, her voice cracking. There was no reply, just the crunch of snow from the darkness behind her. Whipping around, Lena saw nothing but endless white. Her breathing grew ragged. "This isn't real," she whispered, clutching her scarf as though it could ward off whatever unseen terror was closing in. Then she saw them, tracks in the snow. But they weren't hers. The footprints were long, twisted, and inhuman, leading off the path and into the black forest beyond. They shimmered faintly, as though made of ice. Against every instinct, Lena followed them. The path led her deeper into the woods, where the snow thickened, muffling every sound except her ragged breathing. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the clearing, cloaked in white, its face obscured by a veil of frost. In its hands was something small, glowing faintly blue, a shard of ice pulsing like a heartbeat. The figure slowly turned toward her. "Welcome home," it said in her mother's voice. Lena's legs felt rooted to the ground, her body trembling as the figure advanced. The voice, it was unmistakably her mother's, yet the tone carried an edge, a wrongness that made her skin crawl. "What are you?" Lena stammered, her breath coming in panicked puffs. The figure halted, standing eerily still. Its veil of frost shifted in the wind, revealing a face that wasn't quite human. Hollow eyes stared out from a mask of ice, and its lips curved into a smile that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. "You've come," it whispered, "just as they said you would." Lena took a step back, her boots slipping on the icy ground. "I don't know what you're talking about. My mother is dead." The creature tilted its head, mimicking human curiosity. "Oh, she is, but death is such a fragile thing in the frost." The shard in its hand pulsed brighter, casting an eerie glow across the clearing. Shadows danced on the snow, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed alive. Lena's eyes flicked to the glowing shard. It seemed almost alive, vibrating faintly in the creature's grip. "What do you want?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. The creature stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. "To show you the truth, the cold doesn't forget, child. It remembers the promises you've broken, the lives you've abandoned." Lena's blood ran cold. "I've done nothing wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not yet," the creature replied, its grin widening. "But the frost sees what you will do. It hungers for you, Lena." The words struck her like a blow. How did it know her name? Her mind raced, grasping for logic, but the air around her grew colder, biting into her skin even through her coat. Her breath came in shorter gasps, the cold stealing it from her lungs. Then she noticed the trees. The skeletal branches were moving, bending unnaturally toward her. Snow fell in thick clumps, trapping her in a tightening circle. The creature extended the shard toward her, its glow intensifying. "Take it," it said. "This is your inheritance." Lena's hand stayed at her sides. "No," she choked out. "I don't want anything from you." The creature's grin faltered, replaced by something darker, more menacing. "You don't have a choice." The ground beneath her cracked with a deafening roar. Lena screamed as the snow collapsed, and she plummeted into darkness, the icy cold enveloping her like a shroud. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the forest. She was lying on a frozen lake, the ice beneath her so clear she could see the dark waters swirling below. And in the depths, shadowy figures moved, their faces pressed against the ice, watching her. Above her, the creature stood at the lake's edge, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "Welcome to where it all began," it said, its voice echoing eerily. The ice cracked beneath her. The sound of cracking ice echoed like gunfire across the frozen lake. Lena scrambled to her knees, her gloved hands sliding over the slick surface. Beneath her, the figures pressed against the ice shifted, their faces contorted in silent screams. "Help me!" she yelled, but her voice disappeared into the oppressive stillness. The creature on the shore didn't move. It simply watched, its frost-veiled face unreadable. The ice beneath her buckled, a jagged line splintering toward her. Cold terror shot through her veins as she felt the surface lurch. She crawled desperately toward the shore, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Crack! A chunk of ice broke free, sending her sprawling. The frozen water lapped at her hands, stinging with an unnatural chill. Lena cried out, pulling herself back onto the solid surface, but the cold clung to her fingers, spreading like frostbite. "You're running from what you cannot escape," the creature's voice echoed, distant yet clear. "The frost claims all it touches." "Leave me alone!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. The creature tilted its head, as if considering her words. Then it raised the glowing shard, and the waters beneath her erupted. The dark figures surged upward, their forms twisting like smoke as they broke through the ice. They weren't human, not anymore. Their limbs were elongated, their faces frozen in expressions of anguish. Their eyes burned with a faint blue light, the same hue as the shard. One of them reached for her, its hand skeletal and ice-covered. "Lena!" it rasped, its voice gurgling like water trapped in its throat. She recoiled, but the figure didn't stop. Its frozen grip latched onto her ankle, and a searing cold shot through her leg. She screamed, kicking wildly, but more hands emerged from the shattered ice, grasping at her arms, her coat, her hair. "You're one of us now," the voices whispered, overlapping in a haunting cacophony. "No, I'm not!" Lena thrashed against their grip, her body writhing in panic. Her nails scraped against the ice as they dragged her toward the freezing water. The cold bit into her skin, her lungs burning as the frosty air thickened around her. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she would succumb. But then she spotted it, the shard, still glowing faintly in the creature's hand. It pulsed rhythmically, as if alive. Summoning her remaining strength, Lena twisted her body and kicked free of the icy hands, lunging toward the shore. The creature didn't move, as though it were testing her resolve. She crawled closer, her numb fingers stretching toward the shard. The moment her hand grazed its surface, a jolt of energy coursed through her. The voices around her stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. The shard's glow seeped into her skin, and the ice beneath her stilled, the waters freezing solid once more. She looked up at the creature, now standing directly over her. Its smile returned, wider than before. "Do you see now?" it whispered. "The frost is in you." Lena's chest heaved as the shard's glow intensified, spreading through her veins like wildfire. She screamed as the cold consumed her from the inside out, her breath turning to mist. And then everything went black. Lena woke to silence. The world around her was blindingly white, the endless snow stretching in every direction. She sat up with a groan, her body aching. But the icy chill she expected was gone. Instead, her skin felt wrong, like it wasn't entirely her own. She glanced at her hands. The veins beneath her skin shimmered faintly with an icy blue hue, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The shard was gone, but its presence lingered in the frost that seemed to have settled within her. "Where am I?" she whispered, her breath no longer visible in the cold air. The creature was nowhere to be seen, nor were the twisted figures beneath the ice. She was alone, or so she thought. The silence was broken by a distant crunch of snow. Lena froze, her pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the horizon. It was human, or at least appeared to be. The man wore a heavy coat, his face partially obscured by a fur-lined hood. He moved with purpose, his eyes locked on her. "You shouldn't be here," he said when he was close enough, his voice sharp and laced with fear. "No one survives the frostbound lake." "I didn't have a choice," Lena replied, her voice trembling. "Something dragged me here. A creature. It gave me this." She held up her hands, showing him the frost glowing beneath her skin. The man's face paled. "You've been marked," he muttered, taking a step back. "You need to leave. Now." "Wait!" Lena cried, grabbing his arm. "What does this mean? What's happening to me?" He pulled free, his eyes darting nervously around the endless expanse of snow. "The Frostbinders don't choose people lightly. If they marked you, it means you're theirs." "Whose?" Lena demanded, her desperation mounting. "The Frostbinders," he hissed. "They're ancient, older than the storms, older than the snow itself. They take the weak, the lost, and they turn them into one of their own. You've already started changing." Lena's stomach churned. Changing into what? Before the man could answer, a low, resonant sound echoed across the tundra. It was like a deep horn, vibrating through the air and rattling Lena's chest. The man's face twisted in terror. "They're coming," he whispered. A shadow appeared on the horizon, dark and massive, moving impossibly fast across the snow. The man bolted without another word, disappearing into the white haze. Lena's feet refused to move, her body frozen as the shadow grew closer. The horn blared again, louder this time, and Lena realized the sound wasn't coming from the shadow. It was coming from within her. Her chest burned as the frost inside her veins pulsed brighter, her body trembling with a cold that wasn't entirely external. The shadow came into focus, revealing a towering figure wrapped in flowing ice and snow. Its eyes burned the same blue as the frost in Lena's veins. "You belong to us now," it said, its voice reverberating through her mind. Lena turned to run, but the snow beneath her feet surged upward like a living thing, wrapping around her ankles and dragging her down. She screamed, clawing at the ground, as the towering figure loomed closer, and then the snow swallowed her whole. Lena's world turned to darkness, but it wasn't the comforting black of sleep. It was thick and oppressive, carrying the weight of ice and centuries of silence. She clawed at the air, gasping, until she broke through into a new realm, a cavern of endless frost. The walls shimmered with frozen veins of blue light, their patterns pulsing in unison with her heartbeat. Ice formations hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, dripping with water that froze before it hit the ground. Lena stumbled forward, her breath catching as the frost inside her veins flared, guiding her deeper into the icy expanse. "You cannot run!" the voice boomed, echoing from all directions. It wasn't just the towering figure's voice. It was layered with hundreds, maybe thousands of others, all whispering the same words. "Why me?" Lena shouted, her voice breaking. She turned in circles, searching for the source. "I didn't ask for this." The air shifted, and the figure emerged from the shadows, its form larger and more menacing than before. The icy cloak it wore billowed without wind, and its hollow, glowing eyes bore into her. "You were chosen," it said simply. "Your soul carries the frost mark, the tether to this realm." "I don't want your mark," Lena yelled, stepping backward. "Take it back. Leave me alone." The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "It is not something you can reject. The frost chooses whom it claims, and it has chosen you." The ground beneath Lena's feet rumbled, cracking with veins of glowing blue light. Shadows began to rise from the ice, taking on humanoid forms. Their eyes burned with the same frost blue glow, and their faces twisted with anguish. "Do you recognize them?" the figure asked, gesturing with one massive hand. Lena's heart sank as she stared at the shadows. They weren't strangers. She saw the face of her mother, her lips moving soundlessly as if pleading for help. Behind her, more familiar faces emerged, friends, distant relatives, even her childhood neighbor who had disappeared years ago in a winter storm. "They were marked, just like you," the figure continued, "and now they serve the frost." "No," Lena whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. It can't be real." The figure took a step closer, its towering presence casting a cold shadow over her. The frost will take everything from you. It will devour your memories, your humanity, until you are nothing but ice and shadow. Unless... Unless what? Lena demanded, desperation lacing her voice. The figure raised a hand, and the glowing shard from before materialized, floating just above its palm. Claim the shard, bind yourself to the frost willingly, and you may yet retain your will. Resist, and you will join them. The shadows around her reached for her, their icy hands grazing her skin, sending jolts of cold pain through her body. She recoiled, her mind racing. Choose, the figure commanded, its voice booming. But choose quickly. The frost waits for no one. Lena's hands trembled as she stared at the shard, its glow both beautiful and terrifying. The whispers of the shadows grew louder, pleading, warning, begging. Her heart pounded as she reached forward, the ice beneath her feet cracking under the weight of her decision. Just as her fingers brushed the shard, a deafening scream erupted from the shadows behind her. Something else was in the cavern. The scream was unlike anything Lena had ever heard. It was raw, guttural, and filled with rage. The shadows surrounding her scattered like ash in the wind, retreating into the icy walls. Even the towering figure, so composed and commanding, froze in place. The shard flickered in its hand, its glow dimming as the sound reverberated through the cavern. "What is that?" Lena gasped, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. For the first time, it looked unsure, its hollow eyes scanning the dark corners of the icy expanse. The ground rumbled again, but this time it wasn't the frost's doing. Something far older, far more menacing, stirred in the depths of the cavern. A massive crack split the floor, jagged and wide, revealing a chasm of swirling frost and shadows. From the depths rose a figure unlike any Lena had seen. It was neither entirely human nor entirely creature. Its body was covered in jagged shards of black ice, and its face was obscured by a mask of frost, ancient and worn. Blue flames flickered in its hollow eyes. "The Keeper," the towering figure murmured, its voice laced with something Lena hadn't heard before, fear. The Keeper's head turned slowly toward Lena, and its gaze burned through her. She felt an icy weight press against her chest, and the frost in her veins pulsed violently, as if trying to escape her body. "You dare to mark another without my consent?" the Keeper growled, its voice deep and resonant, shaking the cavern. The towering figure stepped back, its icy cloak quivering as though it were alive. "She was chosen," the figure said, its confidence faltering. "She bears the frost mark. It is her destiny." "Destiny?" the Keeper roared, the sound like a storm raging in a hollow void. "You forget your place, servant. The frost answers to me." It raised a hand, and the shard in the towering figure's grasp shattered, its glowing fragments scattering across the cavern floor. The light in Lena's veins flickered violently, her body convulsing as she fell to her knees. The Keeper stepped closer, towering over both Lena and the Frostbinder. Its gaze bore into her. "You are not like the others," it said, its voice quieter now, though no less menacing. "Your will is strong. The frostmark has not consumed you." "What do you want from me?" Lena managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The Keeper crouched, its massive form lowering until it was face to face with her. "There is another way," it said, its icy breath chilling her to the bone. "The frost does not control you, but if you wish to survive, you must prove yourself worthy." "How?" Lena asked, desperation clear in her voice. The Keeper's gaze flicked to the towering figure, which had shrunk back into the shadows. "Destroy what enslaved you, break its hold on the frost, and you may yet reclaim your life." Lena's pulse quickened. "And if I don't?" The Keeper straightened, its form growing even more imposing. "Then you will remain here, frozen and forgotten, until the frost takes you entirely." The cavern shuddered again, cracks spreading across the walls as Lena stood, her legs trembling. The towering figure let out a guttural growl, its icy form surging forward. "You dare defy me?" it bellowed. "You will join the frost as it was always meant to be." The Keeper's voice thundered through the cavern. "Choose now, girl. Face the Frostbinder or succumb to it." Lena's hand darted to the shattered shards of the glowing ice. They were sharp, jagged, and pulsing faintly with residual energy. Her fingers closed around one, its edge slicing into her palm as she turned to face the towering figure. The frostbinder roared, its icy tendrils lashing out, and Lena screamed as she charged toward it, the shard glowing brighter in her hand. Lena sprinted toward the frostbinder, her heart pounding, and the shard blazing in her hand like a fragment of captured fire. The cavern trembled with every step, the air thick with frost and malice. The frostbinder roared, its towering form unfurling jagged limbs of ice that lashed out like spears. "You cannot defeat me," it bellowed, its voice cracking like glaciers breaking apart. "The frost is eternal. You are nothing but a fleeting shadow." Lena ducked under one of its icy tendrils, the sharp edge grazing her cheek. She winced, but didn't stop. The shard in her hand pulsed with a heat that felt alive, countering the cold threatening to freeze her from within. Behind her, the keeper stood motionless, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It made no move to intervene. This was her battle to fight. The frostbinder lunged again, its massive form bending unnaturally as it struck the ground. The impact sent a shockwave through the cavern, shattering nearby icicles into deadly shards. Lena rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the splinters. Her breath came in ragged gasps, every muscle in her body screaming for her to stop. But she couldn't. Not now. As the frostbinder reared back for another strike, Lena saw her opening. The shard in her hand flared brighter, its light cutting through the oppressive darkness. She pushed forward, her feet sliding on the icy ground, and drove the shard into the frostbinder's chest. The creature let out a deafening, otherworldly scream. Its icy body convulsed as cracks spread outward from the point of impact, glowing with an intense blue light. Lena staggered back, her eyes wide as the frostbinder's form began to collapse. "No!" it roared, its voice splintering into 1,000 echoes. "You cannot destroy the frost! You cannot—" The frostbinder exploded in a shower of ice and light, the force throwing Lena to the ground. She lay there for a moment, the silence ringing in her ears, before she pushed herself up on trembling arms. The air around her was different now, warmer, lighter, as though the frost itself had been subdued. The keeper approached, its towering form casting a long shadow over her. "You have done what many could not," it said, its voice low and reverent. "The frostbinder is no more." Lena looked down at her hands. The frostmark in her veins had dimmed, the blue glow fading to a faint shimmer. She felt lighter, freer, but the shard still rested in her palm, its surface cracked and dim. "Am I free?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The keeper tilted its head. "For now, but the frost leaves its mark forever. You carry its power within you, a bond that cannot be undone." Lena's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" The keeper's eyes burned brighter. "You are no longer its prisoner, but neither are you untouched. The frost will call to you, and one day you must answer." Before she could protest, the cavern began to dissolve around her, the icy walls crumbling into mist. Lena felt herself falling, her body weightless as the frostmark on her skin flared one last time. She woke on the edge of the forest, the gray snow crunching beneath her as she sat up. The village of Hollow's Reach was visible in the distance, its rooftops dusted with fresh snow. The shard in her hand was gone, replaced by a faint scar across her palm. Lena stood, her body trembling with exhaustion. She took a step forward, then paused. The wind whispered through the trees, faint and familiar. "We'll be waiting," it said, her mother's voice echoing in the cold. Lena pulled her scarf tighter and walked toward the village, the frostmark faintly glowing beneath her skin. The frost had let her go, for now. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield as snow battered her car in relentless waves. The winding mountain road had disappeared beneath a thick white blanket, leaving her with no choice but to creep forward at a snail's pace. She cursed herself for taking the detour through the Rockies, but the thought of shaving an hour off her trip home had been too tempting. Now she was trapped, alone, with nothing but her dim headlights cutting through the blizzard. The GPS on her phone flickered, then died altogether, leaving her with a blank screen. "Great," she muttered, glancing at the fuel gauge. Less than a quarter of a tank. That's when she saw it. A faint glow in the distance. A cabin. Relief flooded through her as she pulled the car to the side of the road. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, bracing herself for the biting wind as she stepped out into the storm. The snow was knee-deep, making every step a struggle, but the warm glow of the cabin's windows gave her hope. Someone had to be inside. The door creaked as she knocked, her gloves muffling the sound. "Hello," she called out. "Is anyone there?" No answer. She tried the doorknob. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. The door swung open, revealing a cozy interior lit by a crackling fire. A kettle steamed on the stove, and a thick blanket lay draped over a rocking chair. It looked as if someone had just stepped out. "Hello?" Claire called again, stepping inside. The warmth was a welcome contrast to the frigid storm, and she shut the door behind her, shaking off the snow. On the table near the fire, a single piece of paper caught her eye. It was old, the edges yellowed and torn, but the handwriting was precise and clear. "Do not stay after dark." Claire frowned, glancing at the window. The light was fading fast, the storm outside growing fiercer. She turned back to the note, a chill creeping up her spine. The kettle on the stove whistled suddenly, startling her. She hadn't turned it on. The door behind her slammed shut, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, creeping closer as the fire dimmed. Claire spun around at the sound of the door slamming shut. The cabin was empty, but the air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural stillness. The shadows cast by the dimming fire seemed alive, stretching along the walls as if reaching for her. She bolted to the door and yanked it open, hoping to find someone, anyone, outside. The storm raged on, snow swirling violently in the wind. Her flashlight beam illuminated the fresh powder, and her breath caught in her throat. Footprints. They weren't hers. They were larger, uneven, as if someone, or something, had been dragging their feet. The tracks started at the cabin's doorstep and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Claire hesitated, the storm's icy tendrils biting at her exposed skin. She turned back to the note on the table, its ominous warning seared into her mind. "Do not stay after dark." Her instincts screamed to leave, but the storm made it impossible. Returning to the road meant risking the car running out of gas, or worse, sliding off the icy cliffs. She had no choice but to stay until the storm eased. Closing the door, she grabbed the kettle off the stove and poured the boiling water down the sink. She hadn't heard anyone light the fire or set the kettle to boil. Who had been here before her? The rocking chair by the fire creaked softly, breaking the silence. Claire froze. The chair hadn't moved since she'd entered. Now, it swayed back and forth, the blanket slipping slightly from its back. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding. Just as she reached for the blanket, a faint sound stopped her. Crunch. It was muffled but distinct, coming from outside. She turned toward the window, the beam of her flashlight illuminating the snow just beyond the glass. Her stomach dropped. The footprints were back. This time, they were closer. Claire backed away, clutching the flashlight tightly. The fire flickered again, almost snuffing out entirely. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. Her breath hitched. She hadn't heard anyone approach. The footprints had stopped several feet from the cabin. Whoever, or whatever it was, they hadn't left the snow. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" Claire called, her voice trembling. No response. Just the sound of the wind howling. She edged closer to the door, her flashlight shaking in her hands. Slowly, she reached for the handle. Before she could grasp it, a voice whispered from the other side. "Let me in. Let me in." The words were barely audible, muffled by the storm, yet they sent a jolt of fear through Claire's body. The voice was calm, almost too calm, with a hollow quality that didn't sound entirely human. She froze, her hand inches from the doorknob. Who are you?" she managed to choke out. There was no immediate answer, just the wind howling through the cracks in the cabin. Then the voice came again, softer this time, but unmistakably close. "I'm cold. Let me in." Claire's heart pounded as she glanced out the window. The flashlight's beam revealed nothing but swirling snow. The footprints that had been so close moments ago were gone, erased by the storm. Her grip tightened on the flashlight. "I can't help you," she called out, her voice shaky. "You need to leave." Silence. The fire sputtered, casting strange flickering shadows across the walls. The rocking chair creaked again, as if mocking her fear. She backed away from the door, every instinct screaming that something was very, very wrong. Suddenly the voice spoke again, louder this time, as though it were coming from inside the cabin. Let. Mr. Claire whipped around, the flashlight beam slicing through the dimly lit room. It was empty. Her breath came in shallow gasps, clouding the air as the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. The fire burned low, its warmth barely reaching her. A new sound broke the silence: scratching. It came from the walls, faint at first, then growing louder, more frantic, as if something, or someone, was clawing to get inside. Claire stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the blanket on the floor. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a face pressed against the frost-covered window, pale, featureless, and watching. Her scream caught in her throat as the door rattled violently. The knocking had returned, but this time it was furious, almost unhinged. The voice joined it, repeating the same phrase over and over, each word dripping with malice. "Let me in! Let me in!" Claire grabbed the table and shoved it against the door, her trembling hands struggling to keep her grip. The rattling stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, oppressive. She stood there, heart racing, until a faint creak made her spin around. The rocking chair was moving again, slowly swaying back and forth, and this time, someone was sitting in it. A figure draped in the same blanket stared at her with empty eyes, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Claire's flashlight flickered out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. A whisper filled the room, colder than the storm outside. "You let me in!" Claire's scream caught in her throat as the figure in the rocking chair slowly rose. It was impossibly tall, its blanket-covered form stretching unnaturally like a shadow pulled too thin. The empty eyes stared at her, unblinking, as the chair creaked back and forth, even though it was no longer sitting. The fire in the hearth sputtered and went out entirely, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The only light came from the frost-covered window, faintly illuminated by the storm outside. Claire stumbled backward, her hands grasping for anything to defend herself. Her fingers found the iron poker by the fireplace, and she brandished it like a weapon, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stay back!" she shouted, though her voice quivered. "I swear I'll—" The figure took a single step forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crawled up the walls, spreading across the floor and sealing the door with an icy crust. Claire could see her breath now, clouds of panic as the figure loomed closer. "I didn't let you in!" she cried, her voice desperate. "I didn't open the door!" The figure paused, tilting its head as if considering her words. Then it spoke, its voice a cold whisper that echoed through the cabin. "You called me." "What?" Claire's grip on the poker tightened. "I didn't call anyone." The figure's hand emerged from beneath the blanket, long and skeletal, covered in frost that glimmered faintly in the dim light. It pointed toward the table where the note still lay, its edges now frozen solid. Claire followed its gesture, her mind racing. She hadn't called anyone, but then she remembered. The storm, the footprints, the strange kettle whistling when no one was there. What if her presence in the cabin had been enough? What if the act of staying had been the invitation? "You called me," the figure repeated, its hollow eyes boring into her. "And now, you must pay the price." "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The figure's skeletal hand moved closer, the frost spreading across the floor like a living thing. It reached for her, and Claire swung the poker wildly, the iron tip slicing through the air. The figure recoiled with an ear-piercing screech, and the frost momentarily stopped its advance. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed the note from the table, stuffing it into her coat pocket, and made a break for the window. The frost-covered glass shattered under the force of her iron poker, the icy wind outside stinging her face. She climbed through the broken window, cutting her hands on the shards, and landed in the snow. The storm howled around her, blinding and deafening, but she ran, her boots crunching through the drifts. Behind her, the cabin groaned as if alive. She dared a glance over her shoulder and saw the figure standing in the shattered window, its empty eyes locked on her. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice carrying unnaturally through the storm. "The snow will find you." The ground beneath her gave way, and Claire screamed as she fell, tumbling into an icy abyss hidden beneath the snow. Claire's body hit the icy ground with a bone-rattling thud. Her flashlight tumbled out of her pocket, flickering weakly before stabilizing, casting a faint glow over the cavern she had fallen into. The air was colder here, sharper, like knives cutting into her lungs with every breath. She sat up slowly, her head spinning. Around her, the walls of the cavern shimmered with frost, reflecting the weak light of the flashlight. Icicles hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the stillness. She rubbed her arms, trying to warm herself, but the frost seemed to seep into her skin, numbing her from the inside out. Her fingers trembled as she retrieved the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The cavern wasn't empty. Figures were embedded in the icy walls, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Men, women, even children, trapped mid-scream, their hands clawing at the ice that encased them. Claire's breath hitched as she took a step closer to one of them, a woman whose face was eerily familiar. It was the same woman whose pale, frost-covered face had appeared at the cabin window. Claire stumbled backward, her stomach churning. She wasn't just trapped in a cavern, she was in a graveyard. The sound of crunching snow echoed behind her. She whipped around, the flashlight beam trembling in her hands. The figure from the cabin was there, standing at the edge of the cavern, its skeletal form even taller and more menacing in the confined space. "You ran," it said, its voice echoing in her mind. "But there is no escape from the snow." Claire clenched the iron poker, raising it defensively. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figure stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate. "You took what was not yours," it hissed. "The cabin, the fire, you broke the rule." "I didn't know," Claire cried. "I just needed shelter from the storm." "The storm is my domain," the figure replied, its hollow eyes narrowing. "You entered uninvited. Now you belong to the snow." The frost on the walls seemed to pulse, the frozen faces twitching as if trying to move. Claire's flashlight flickered, casting the cavern in brief flashes of light and shadow. The figure loomed closer, its skeletal hand reaching for her. Claire swung the poker wildly, the metal clanging against the ice. The figure screeched, retreating slightly, but the frost on the walls began to crawl toward her, encasing the floor and climbing up her boots. Panicking, Claire pulled the note from her pocket, the edges brittle with ice. "Do not stay after dark." She turned the paper over, desperate for more clues, and found something scrawled on the back in the same precise handwriting. "Follow the frozen flames." Her flashlight flickered again, and in its dim glow, she saw them. Blue flames, faint and ethereal, dancing deeper in the cavern. They led to a narrow tunnel, barely visible through the ice. The figure let out a furious roar as Claire bolted toward the flames, the frost biting at her heels. The tunnel was narrow and jagged, forcing Claire to duck and squeeze her way through as the ethereal blue flames guided her deeper into the icy labyrinth. The air was colder here, almost suffocating, and her every breath felt like shards of glass cutting into her lungs. Behind her, the figure's enraged roar echoed through the cavern, growing louder with each passing second. The frost that crept up the walls seemed alive, pulsating in rhythm with the footsteps that followed her. "Faster!" Claire whispered to herself, pushing forward. Her legs burned, her boots slipping on the icy floor, but the faint glow of the flames gave her purpose. She couldn't stop. Not now. The tunnel opened into another cavern, vast and cathedral-like, with a domed ceiling of crystalline ice. In the center of the room stood an altar carved from glacial stone, and on it lay an object that pulsed with a faint blue glow, a heart-shaped fragment of ice, its surface swirling with frost. The flames danced around the altar, illuminating the frozen faces embedded in the walls. These faces were different from the ones in the first cavern. They weren't screaming. They were calm, their expressions almost serene. Their eyes glowed faintly, as if they were watching her. Claire approached the altar cautiously, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The icy heart seemed to thrum with energy, its glow intensifying the closer she came. Instinctively, she reached for it, her fingers trembling as they brushed its cold surface. A voice boomed through the cavern, stopping her cold. "Do not touch what you cannot command." The figure from the cabin emerged from the tunnel, its skeletal frame larger than before, nearly scraping the domed ceiling. The frost swirled around it, alive and seething with malice. "What is this?" Claire demanded, gesturing to the altar. "Why are you doing this to me?" The figure's hollow eyes burned brighter. This is the heart of the storm. It binds all who trespass, all who defy the snow. You cannot wield it, and you cannot escape it. Claire's mind raced. The note's cryptic message about the flames had led her here, to this altar, this heart. It had to mean something. Maybe it was the key to stopping the storm, to breaking the figure's hold over her. The frost crept closer, encircling her feet. The faces in the walls began to hum softly, their faint glow intensifying. Claire gritted her teeth, her grip tightening on the iron poker. "I'm not staying here," she said through clenched teeth. "Not forever." The figure lunged toward her, its icy claws outstretched. Claire acted on instinct, driving the poker into the heart of the altar. The icy heart cracked with a deafening roar, and the cavern erupted in blinding blue light. The figure screamed, its skeletal form writhing as the frost recoiled violently. The frozen faces in the walls began to melt, their expressions flickering with relief before fading into nothingness. But the cavern wasn't stable. Cracks spread across the walls and ceiling, chunks of ice crashing to the floor. The altar trembled, its glow dimming as the icy heart shattered completely. The figure's skeletal form lunged, its icy claws reaching for Claire as the cavern trembled around her. She leaped backward, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and stumbled toward the tunnel she had come through. The air was thick with the roar of collapsing ice, the ground splitting beneath her feet. "You cannot destroy the storm!" the figure bellowed, its voice fractured and echoing. "You are part of it now!" Claire didn't look back. She sprinted toward the tunnel, her legs burning and her breath ragged. The blue flames that had once guided her flickered faintly, as if struggling to survive. The frost surged along the walls, chasing her like a living thing, tendrils reaching for her ankles. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing her to crawl as the walls closed in. Behind her, the figure's furious roars grew louder, mingling with the sound of shattering ice. She could feel the frost biting at her boots, numbing her legs as she clawed her way forward. Finally, she burst into the open air, collapsing in the snow. The storm still raged, but the winds were different now, wilder, more chaotic, as if the storm itself was unraveling. The faint glow of the shattered heart lingered in the clouds above, pulsing like a dying star. Claire stumbled to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion. She turned back toward the cavern just in time to see the figure emerge, its form fractured and unstable. The frost around it flickered erratically, its power weakened but still menacing. "You cannot outrun what you've become," it hissed, its voice cracking like brittle ice. "The storm is in you now." Claire's heart sank as the words washed over her. She glanced down at her hands and her breath caught. The frost was there, creeping beneath her skin, faint but unmistakable. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, a cold, unrelenting presence. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not yours." The figure extended a jagged hand, the frost mark in her veins flaring in response. "You broke the heart. You severed the bond. But the storm never truly ends." The ground beneath it began to crumble, the cavern collapsing in on itself. Claire took a step back as the figure let out a final, ear-piercing shriek. The frost surged upward in one last desperate wave before vanishing into the churning sky. The storm began to subside, the howling winds fading into a gentle snowfall. Claire stood alone, the silence deafening. The landscape around her was unrecognizable, buried in endless white. The cabin was gone, swallowed by the snow. She touched her chest, feeling the faint, icy rhythm beneath her skin. The frostmark glimmered faintly, a reminder of what she had endured and what she had become. Claire turned and began walking, her footsteps crunching in the snow. She didn't know where she was going, but one thing was certain. The storm had let her go, for now. But the frost was always watching. The snowstorm had rolled in faster than anyone expected. By the time Mia reached the outskirts of the small mountain town, the roads were nearly impassable. Thick flakes swirled in the air, obscuring her vision, and her car's wipers barely kept up with the deluge. She was visiting the remote town of Keldon for work, a last-minute assignment to photograph the local landscapes for a travel piece. But now all thoughts of work were drowned out by the storm's ferocity. Her GPS sputtered and lost signal just as she saw the sign for Ravenwood Inn. Relief washed over her as she pulled into the small parking lot. the cozy lights of the inn a beacon in the blizzard. It looked quaint but sturdy, with frosted windows glowing warmly. Inside, the inn was eerily quiet. A cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, but no one was at the reception desk. The air smelled faintly of pine and something metallic, though Mia couldn't place it. She rang the bell and waited, rubbing her hands together for warmth. A tall, thin man with sunken eyes eventually emerged from a door behind the desk. His movements were stiff, his expression vacant, though he forced a polite smile. "Welcome to Ravenwood," he said in a monotone voice. "You'll be our only guest tonight." "That's fine," Mia replied, brushing snow from her coat. "The storm's worse than I expected. Is it okay if I stay a couple of nights?" The man hesitated before nodding. "Of course. We're happy to have you." He handed her a key and gestured toward the stairs. "Room 203. Please stay inside tonight. The storm can be unpredictable." The warning struck her as odd, but she was too tired to question it. After settling into her room, Mia noticed something peculiar. The window overlooked the town square, where a massive tree stood at its center, its branches laden with snow. At first glance, the scene was serene, but something caught her eye. Beneath the tree, the snow seemed disturbed, like something had been moving, digging underneath it. She squinted, her breath fogging the glass. Just then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic scratching noise. It wasn't coming from the window. It was beneath her. A chill crept up her spine as she stepped back. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking across wood. Mia glanced at the floorboards. The sound was directly below her. Mia stared at the floor, her pulse quickening as the scratching grew louder. It was steady, deliberate, as if something, or someone, was trying to burrow its way up through the wooden planks. She knelt cautiously, pressing her ear to the floorboards. The noise was unmistakable now, a rhythmic scrape-scrape thud, like nails being dragged across wood, followed by a hollow tap. Her breath hitched as she realized it was coming from directly below her room. Mia stood abruptly, her heart pounding. "It's probably just the pipes," she whispered to herself, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or rats." She grabbed her phone, hoping to distract herself, but there was no signal, not even Wi-Fi. The screen flickered and went dark, leaving her with only the dim light of the bedside lamp. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a living thing. Mia glanced back at the window. The massive tree in the town square loomed eerily in the distance, its snow-laden branches swaying unnaturally in the wind. The disturbed snow beneath it had deepened, the depression now more pronounced. It almost looked like a pit. The scratching below her stopped suddenly, replaced by a heavy dragging sound. Mia froze, straining to hear. It was faint but deliberate, as if something large was moving beneath the inn. Unable to ignore it any longer, she grabbed her coat and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The inn was silent except for the occasional groan of the storm. The wooden floor creaked under her weight as she made her way toward the staircase. When she reached the lobby, the thin man from earlier was gone. A draft of icy air hit her, and she noticed the front door was slightly ajar. Snow blew in, forming small drifts on the floor. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. No answer. Mia stepped closer to the door, intending to shut it, but something outside stopped her cold. There, in the snow, were a set of footprints, bare footprints, impossibly large, leading from the inn toward the tree in the square. Her heart raced as she realized something else. There were drag marks beside the prints, like something heavy had been pulled through the snow. She turned back toward the desk, hoping to find the man, but stopped short. On the wall behind the desk was a series of framed photographs, each depicting a winter landscape of Keldon. One photo caught her eye. The same tree in the square, but taken decades ago. A crowd of people stood around it, their faces blurred and indistinct. But at the base of the tree was a pit, and in that pit was a figure, its skeletal hand clawing upward. Mia's stomach churned as the scratching sound started again, this time from directly beneath the lobby. Mia's heart thundered as the scratching intensified, coming from the floor beneath the lobby. She backed away from the desk, her eyes darting toward the photographs again. The blurred faces in the crowd seemed wrong now, their indistinct forms unsettling, as though they were never meant to be seen. Her breathing quickened as she turned back toward the door. The massive footprints leading toward the tree were already being erased by the storm, but the drag marks remained, faint but visible. Something had been taken. Or someone. The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, amplifying the sound of her own racing heart. Then came the creak, a slow, deliberate groan of wood shifting beneath her feet. "Mia!" a voice rasped, so faint it might have been the wind. Her name, carried on the howling storm, chilled her more than the cold air. She spun toward the source, but the lobby was empty. Her eyes fell to the front desk again, this time noticing a ledger left open on the counter. The names scrawled on the page were old, their dates spanning decades. But there was one thing they all had in common. None of the guests had checked out. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. Beneath the ledger, a yellowed sheet of paper was tucked carefully. She pulled it free, her hands trembling as she read the jagged handwriting. "The snow is not your friend. The tree remembers. Do not wake what lies beneath." Before she could process the warning, the floor beneath her gave a violent jolt. Mia stumbled, catching herself against the desk. Another deep groan of wood, this time accompanied by a faint cracking sound, sent a wave of panic through her. The thin man appeared suddenly at the base of the staircase, his pale face even more gaunt in the dim light. "You need to go back to your room," he said, his voice monotone but urgent. "Now!" "What's going on here?" Mia demanded, holding up the note. "What's under the tree?" The man's sunken eyes flickered with something like fear. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have—" He cut himself off, his head snapping toward the window as if he'd heard something. "It's awake," he whispered. "What's awake?" Mia pressed, but the man ignored her, retreating up the stairs without another word. A loud thud echoed from beneath the floorboards, followed by another, heavier this time. The dragging sound returned, moving with deliberate purpose. It was no longer below the lobby. It was heading toward the staircase. Mia bolted for the front door, her boots crunching through the snow as she ran toward the square. The storm stung her face, but she didn't stop. Her flashlight beam danced across the darkened tree, the pit beneath it now clearly visible. Something was moving inside the pit. Mia stopped dead in her tracks as a hand, skeletal and coated in frost, clawed its way out of the hole. Mia's breath caught as the skeletal hand gripped the edge of the pit, its frost-covered fingers curling with unnatural strength. The storm swirled violently around her, as if driven by the creature's emergence. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs refused to move. The hand was followed by an arm, thin and impossibly long, its surface glistening like frozen glass. Then came the rest, a towering figure, humanoid in shape but grotesquely elongated, its bones jutting out at odd angles. Its face was a hollow mask of ice, featureless except for two empty sockets where eyes should have been. The creature rose fully from the pit, dragging with it something large and wrapped in tattered cloth. Mia's flashlight illuminated the object, a bundle the size of a person. The drag marks she'd seen earlier suddenly made horrifying sense. The creature turned its head toward her, though it had no visible eyes. Somehow, she felt its gaze pierce through her, freezing her to the core. It dropped the bundle and took a step forward, the snow beneath its feet hissing and melting despite the cold. "Stay back!" Mia shouted, her voice cracking as she waved the flashlight like a weapon. The beam flickered and dimmed, as though the storm itself were feeding on its power. The creature stopped, tilting its head in a slow, deliberate motion. From the pit behind it came a sound, a deep, guttural groan that rumbled through the earth like distant thunder. Mia's flashlight revealed movement in the pit. More shapes were stirring. "No," she whispered, taking a step back. "No, no, no." The bundle at the creature's feet shifted, and Mia's stomach lurched. A pale hand slipped out from the cloth, limp and lifeless. The hand of a person. Mia turned and ran, her boots slipping on the icy ground as she made her way back toward the inn. She needed help, answers, anything to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around her. The thin man was waiting for her at the door, his gaunt face twisted with panic. "You went to the tree," he said, his voice trembling. "Why did you go to the tree?" "There's someone," Mia stammered, gesturing toward the square. "It's pulling people out of the ground. We have to call for help." The man shook his head violently. "You don't understand. It's not pulling them out. It's putting them back." "What are you talking about?" Mia demanded. Before he could answer, the inn shuddered violently. the floor beneath them groaning as cracks spiderwebbed through the wooden planks. The sound of dragging returned, louder now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. "It's too late," the man whispered, backing away from the door. "You woke them." The door blew open with a deafening crack, snow and wind rushing inside. In the swirling storm stood the creature from the pit, its icy frame towering over them, and behind it, more figures were rising from the snow. The creature stepped into the inn, its frost-coated frame towering over Mia and the thin man. Behind it, the rising figures from the snow marched forward, their movements stiff and mechanical, like marionettes guided by invisible strings. Their faces were pale and frozen, their hollow eyes fixed on the doorway. "We have to go!" Mia shouted, grabbing the man's arm. He didn't move, his gaze locked on the approaching figures. "They're not alive," he whispered, his voice shaking. "They never were." The floor groaned again, splitting under the weight of the icy invaders. The creature from the pit reached out a skeletal hand toward Mia, its fingers impossibly long, glistening with frost. She stumbled backward, yanking the thin man with her. "Basement!" he gasped suddenly, snapping out of his trance. "We need to hide." They bolted down the hallway, the dragging sound of the creature's footsteps echoing behind them. The walls frosted over as the cold seeped into the inn, every surface glistening with ice. Mia spotted a trapdoor near the kitchen and threw it open, the man scrambling down first. She followed, pulling the door shut just as the figures reached the hallway. In the basement, the air was thick with dampness and rot. A single flickering light bulb illuminated the space, revealing dusty shelves and old furniture. The man leaned against the wall, clutching his chest. "What are those things?" Mia demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're the forgotten," he said, his breath coming in short gasps. "Bound to the tree, to the snow. They rise when the storm calls." "Why now?" Mia pressed, her fear giving way to anger. "What did I do?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the ceiling as the sound of heavy footsteps moved above them. The tree was supposed to stay dormant, but something disturbed it. It must have sensed. A loud crash cut him off, and the trapdoor above them splintered, icy tendrils snaking through the cracks. The creature's hollow face appeared, peering into the darkness below. "You cannot hide," it rasped, its voice like wind through shattered glass. The tendrils shot downward, wrapping around Mia's leg. She screamed as the cold burned her skin, pulling her upward toward the waiting horde. Mia clawed at the basement floor, her nails scraping against the cold concrete as the icy tendrils dragged her upward. The frost burned through her jeans, numbing her leg as the skeletal figure's hollow face loomed closer. Its frozen sockets bored into her, as if seeing straight through her skin. "Help me!" she screamed, but the thin man stood frozen, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. With a surge of desperation, Mia grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the floor and swung it wildly. The pipe struck the tendrils with a sharp crack, shattering one of them into icy shards. The creature hissed, recoiling slightly, and Mia seized the moment to free her leg. She fell to the ground, panting and clutching the pipe like a lifeline. "Get up!" she shouted at the man, who finally snapped out of his stupor and helped her to her feet. "They'll keep coming," he muttered, his voice shaking. "You can't fight the snow." Mia ignored him, her mind racing. The figures above were gathering, their footsteps a steady drumbeat of doom. She glanced around the basement, desperate for anything that could help. Her eyes landed on an old wooden chest tucked into the corner, half buried under dust and debris. "What's in there?" she demanded, yanking it open. The man hesitated. "It's the records, the history of the town." Inside, Mia found stacks of yellowed papers and brittle leather-bound books. She flipped through them, her hands trembling, until one name leapt off the page: The Binding of Keldon. "It was the Founders," the man whispered, his voice hollow. "They made a pact. The storm protects the town, but only if it's fed." "Fed?" Mia asked, horrified. "Fed what?" "Us," the man said, his face pale. "When the storm comes, it takes one of us to keep the rest safe." Mia's stomach churned as the pieces fell into place. The ledger at the desk, the unending snow, the pit beneath the tree, it was all part of the ritual. The tree wasn't just a landmark, it was a graveyard. And the storm wasn't natural. It was a keeper, ensuring the pact was upheld. That's why the names in the ledger never checked out, Mia whispered. They never left. The man nodded grimly. You shouldn't have come here. You weren't supposed to be part of this. Above them, the trapdoor shattered completely, and the skeletal creature descended, its long limbs bending unnaturally as it crawled into the basement. The frost spread rapidly, freezing everything it touched. You broke the pact, it hissed, its voice resonating with rage. You woke us! Mia backed away, clutching the pipe. I didn't do anything. I don't belong here. The creature pointed a jagged finger at her, the frost mark creeping up her leg where the tendril had touched her. You do now. The other figures began to pour into the basement, their frozen forms moving as one. The man fell to his knees, his breath visible in the freezing air. There's no escape, he murmured. Not for either of us. Mia's eyes darted back to the papers in the chest. A single phrase stood out, scrawled in bold, jagged handwriting. Destroy the heart of the tree. The frost closed in, and Mia made her choice. The frost spread rapidly, the figures closing in as the skeletal creature loomed over Mia. Its icy tendrils stretched toward her, but she tightened her grip on the metal pipe, her eyes darting to the trapdoor's shattered frame. She made a decision. Stay here if you want, she snapped at the thin man, her voice sharp with resolve. But I'm not dying in this basement. Without waiting for a reply, Mia bolted toward the stairs, swinging the pipe at the encroaching figures. Their frozen limbs shattered with each strike, but for every one she felled, two more emerged from the shadows. The skeletal creature lunged, its jagged claws swiping inches from her back. She scrambled through the trapdoor, hauling herself into the storm. The biting wind and blinding snow hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop. Her flashlight flickered weakly in her pocket, barely illuminating the desolate square. The tree loomed ahead, its twisted branches writhing in the gale. The pit beneath it yawned like a dark wound in the snow, and from its depths came the low, guttural growl that had haunted her since she arrived. The heart, she muttered to herself, clutching the pipe as she ran. Destroy the heart. The skeletal creature erupted from the inn behind her, its hollow sockets glowing with frostlight. The horde followed, their collective movements eerily silent against the storm's howl. Mia forced herself forward, her boots slipping on the ice. Reaching the pit, she shone her flashlight downward. At the very bottom, glowing faintly through the swirling frost, was a gnarled, pulsing mass of wood and ice, the heart of the tree. The ground shook as the skeletal creature landed behind her. You cannot break the bond, it hissed, its voice reverberating through the storm. The snow will consume you. Mia ignored it, jumping into the pit without hesitation. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle, but she crawled forward, her eyes locked on the heart. It pulsed violently now, as if aware of her intent. The tendrils reached for her, wrapping around her arms and legs, but she fought back, swinging the pipe with all her strength. The frozen vines shattered as she reached the heart, raising the pipe above her head. This ends now! She screamed, driving the pipe down with all her might. The heart splintered with a deafening crack, releasing a blinding wave of blue light. The tendrils writhed and recoiled, the frost shattering around her like glass. Above her, the skeletal creature howled in rage as its form began to crumble, the horde collapsing into lifeless heaps of snow. The storm stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. Mia climbed out of the pit, her body trembling. The tree was still, its branches frozen in place. The town was empty, buried in snow and silence. She limped back toward the inn, but it too was gone, swallowed by the frost. Only the distant mountains remained, their peaks glistening under a pale sun. Mia looked down at her hand. The frost mark was still there, faint but undeniable. She wasn't free. She never would be.